Thank you very much, Madam Chair. So indeed, I'm from the OECD. Good morning to everyone. Good afternoon to those who may be also joining virtually from other parts of the world. Um, it was really interesting to hear the two previous speakers. I think from Steve's presentation, I'm going to take a little bit of a step back, to sort of try and have an overview of how we've seen the different actors use AI and new technologies in the fight against corruption. So when we talk about foreign bribery, bribery in international business transactions, which is at the corner, our cornerstone instrument, if you will, the Anti-Bribery Convention, we're talking about a very difficult form of crime to detect, to investigate, to prosecute. It hides behind shell companies, it hides behind cross-border payments, complex structures across multiple countries and jurisdictions. And unsurprisingly, traditional methods tend to be slow, too reactive, and that's why the arrival of artificial intelligence, of these new technologies and data analytics is so important. Now, the reason it's important is that criminals are using them, so obviously, other actors that try to fight crime and economic crime in particular also need to use them. So these tools, they provide a chance to move from reacting to more proactively detecting and disrupting bribery before it spreads further. I think the previous examples that were given were quite illustrative in how this can happen very concretely in a specific case. At the OECD, it was mentioned earlier that I have colleagues who worked on the use of AI in public governance, notably public procurement. The first speaker mentioned these. Uh, in our team, which is working on the Anti-Bribery Convention, we've been tracking the shift more in relation to how law enforcement can use it. And so, for instance, we have for the first time, a reference to innovative technologies in our standards, in our anti-bribery recommendation that was adopted by 46 countries in 2021. So that it means that what it means beyond having it as a standard is that we review through our country reviews, our peer exchanges, we see how members are beginning, or in some cases, not just beginning, to experiment with AI, with data analytics in very different ways, at very different speeds. And we are actually noticing that this unevenness really matters, and that if some countries are running ahead and others are left behind, then the global enforcement gap, which already exists, risks widening even further. So part of our role, or at least what we try to do, is to spotlight these experiences, encourage peer learning, like what you're doing today, and also beginning to sketch baseline principles on how to responsibly use AI against corruption, because as we've also heard, there are some risks. So today I'm gonna focus on the fact that there are, in our view, and what we're working on and with, are different stakeholders and how they're using AI and digital technologies to fight corruption. I'll spend a bit more time on enforcement and law enforcement because that is at the core of our work. But I'll also speak to how private sector can use it, and I'll say a few words about civil society and the media, though the previous presentation was obviously much more detailed than I'll be able to do it in this presentation. So starting with enforcement, because that's where we're seeing some of the most striking changes, and that's also where we interact very regularly with law enforcement actors who come to meet at the OECD twice a year for those members of the working group, but we also have a global law enforcement network and regional law enforcement networks, and the use of AI in investigations and prosecutions is very often addressed, both in thematic discussions like the ones we're having today, but among law enforcement, but also in more bilateral meetings that are confidential and that may relate to specific cases. So first of all, on detection, and then I'll go to investigations and prosecution. We know that now some law enforcement agencies are using predictive models to flag anomalies in financial records. Madam Chair, you mentioned months sometimes needed to review this huge quantity of financial information, and now that can be flagged almost instantly with these predictive models. And we know, for instance, the UK Serious Fraud Office uses these. And also in the United States, FinCEN uses AI-supported business rules to link shell companies, offshore accounts, suspicious transactions in real time. And following that, the DOJ's Foreign Corruption Practices Act unit since 2024 has also started using data analytics, not just to prioritize reports that it receives from FinCEN, but to actually generate new investigative leads. I want to mention here one interesting crossover because, as I said, there are several stakeholders and they really all need to work together. One interesting crossover is Quantiverse, which some of you may have heard of, which was developed for banks. And it picked up irregular invoicing patterns recently in a Panamanian holding company. And those anomalies eventually fed into a DEA investigation and arrest. And that's a really good example of how private sector detection can also become enforcement intelligence. On investigations and prosecutions, once a case is open, obviously the use of AI can also help process documents. It can, depending on the tool you use, as mentioned by Stephen, detect among thousands of documents, those that may be covered by client attorney privilege, so that the law enforcement authorities do not review those, but focus themselves on the ones that they can use. And we know, again, to reference the Serious Fraud Office in the UK, that in one foreign bribery case that was concluded, they deployed an AI tool that scanned about 600,000 documents a day to identify privileged material. And that cut a review that they say would have taken 2 years down to just a few months. So I know we'll hear about the World Bank later, but I know from our colleagues there that they use AI-assisted forensic accounting to pull together financial records from different sources to have a sort of coherent evidentiary picture when they do their own investigations at the Integrity Vice Presidency. And we have also among our countries that are party to the convention, some agencies that are using what we call graph neural networks, which is kind of a mouthful. We all like our technical terms, but essentially it's a tool that can map hidden links between individuals, companies, politically exposed persons across vast data sets. And more recently, there was a survey by Thomson Reuters that showed that prosecutors that use large language models to summarize seized documents or translate, because that is also one very useful tool when you've got a case that spans many jurisdictions, translation. So prosecutors that were using these language models that freed them up to focus on the substance, because again, as previous speakers said, and I like the use of it's an intern. It's a really good intern. It's an intern that can speed up your researching process a lot. But ultimately, you need to focus on the substance. But you can stop as a prosecutor sifting through haystacks of papers and use the models to do that for you. Now, obviously, these are exciting examples, but they also raised questions. And one very important one is, do prosecutors and investigators have the right skills to use these tools? And that's also where a gap can occur. And can all countries afford them? Or are we widening the gap, as I mentioned earlier? How do we deal with bias? That was also mentioned by our first speaker. And then, of course, critically, will courts accept AI filtered or generated evidence? So there are cases in the Netherlands, in the UK, where faulty software led to wrongful prosecutions. So understanding the risks of treating automated outputs is really important. Just a few minutes on corporate compliance briefly, and here I really want to stress that I'm keeping it short for time, but it's no less important, and compliance is really an essential part of the anti-bribery system. And artificial intelligence is changing how companies build and monitor their compliance programs. They can have more dynamic risk assessments. They can draw on live external data. Third-party due diligence, which historically has been one of the most resource-intensive tasks, is now automated. Banks obviously are using artificial intelligence to reduce false alerts, for instance, or cut review times. And some firms have developed AI tools that can scan internal company data for bribery risks, flag anomalies for legal teams, etc. And beyond that, a number of law enforcement authorities are expecting corporates to use AI. And that was, for instance, in the US Department of Justice guidance in 2023, which said, we're upping our game with data analytics and we expect companies to do the same. So that creates a real pressure for companies to also implement, to also use AI and new technologies in their compliance efforts. And again, potentially creating a real pressure and a real gap for smaller companies who may not have the same resources to match expectations or needs. And finally, and I don't think I need to spend a lot of time on this because the previous speaker's presentation was extremely, I think, enlightening. But obviously, civil society and the media are a very key leg of this stool. And I will touch on this really briefly, but it's absolutely essential. And we remember all, I'm sure, the Panama Papers or the LuxLeaks scandals, and these concern millions of documents. And without AI-powered graph analytics, journalists would not have been able to piece together the networks of all these shell companies, of all these financial flows. The civil society organizations like Transparency International, they're also piloting AI-enabled whistleblower platforms that can protect anonymity, filter out fabricated claims, that increase credibility, help focus attention on the strongest allegations. The risks here, of course, are again credibility and access. Smaller NGOs may not have funding to use these tools, or algorithms can amplify false leads, and if that happens, then public trust can suffer. But that is why there are significant efforts that are being done. One is, for instance, frameworks like the Paris Charter on the use of AI in journalism, which is quite important. But also institutions like the OCCRP, which brings together civil society, TI notably, and journalists so that they can mutualize their tools and their use and their knowledge of how to use those tools for the benefit of a community of journalists across the globe. So where does that leave us? I guess three cross-cutting lessons. Artificial intelligence amplifies disparities. Trust depends on governance, and the efficiency is going to be meaningless if the evidence is not admissible or if compliant tools reinforce bias. So we need transparency and explainability and oversight. And AI works best with cooperation. So countries, civil society, private sector, that's why we really want to insist on the fact that we need to use these tools together, and it can really amplify the effectiveness of the fight against bribery and economic crime more broadly. Just in the nick of time. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias a nuestra experta Franz Chain de la Organización para la Cooperación y Desarrollo Económico OCDE por su presentación. La verdad que lo que ha compartido es sumamente valioso, incluyendo casos prácticos que pueden ser de gran interés para todos los expertos de este comité del MESICIG. El caso, por ejemplo, de Reino Unido con esos modelos predictivos para justamente revisar esa gran cantidad de casos. Lo interesante de poder construir también ese modelo de lenguaje que alimenta esos mapas tan importantes, tener en cuenta el tema de los sesgos que siempre va a estar presente. Y sobre todo, algo muy importante que quiero dejar en la sala, y es que algo que comentó usted, que las fuerzas de la corrupción están utilizando las tecnologías de la información y específicamente la inteligencia artificial. Entonces nosotros, la fuerza de prevención y de combate de la corrupción, también debemos usarla de la misma manera y poder lograr, bueno, que vayamos avanzando en el tema de la confianza, en el tema de la gobernanza, en el tema de que el uso de la inteligencia, obviamente teniendo este control de este sesgo que puede, siempre el humano siempre tiene que estar presente, necesariamente, pero que pueda también en algún momento ser como utilizado a nivel de la justicia, porque esto también es de gran valor, como usted mencionó. Entonces, muchísimas gracias nuevamente, Frank Shane, por tan importantes y valiosos aportes que ha presentado en la mañana de hoy.